Hey guys, my name is Cyrus RO. I'm making this video to break down an interesting compositional technique that I used in my recent release, All My Cards Are on the Table. The technique that I wanted to talk about corresponds to the drum loop in the song. I'll kind of cut to the punchline for a second and say that basically what it comes down to is some creative application of polymeter. I think this is a really, really useful tool, particularly in a digital landscape, in ways that it maybe isn't useful in a traditional sense, or at least it's less useful. I thought that the way that I used it here was kind of interesting, and so I wanted to share it with you. So I'll play the first little bit of the song, just so that you guys have the scene set, so to speak. Yeah, so that was basically the intro of the song. As you can hear, it's got like kind of a pretty traditional dance type vibe. And I think that's really characterized by maybe the most basic element in the song, which is what I started with when I was writing it. And that would be the kick and the snare drum. So here's what those sound like isolated. So about as simple as you can get, and that's like probably like the most canonical rhythm in all of pop music, at least Western pop music. Kicks on 1, 2, 3, 4, snares on 2 and 4. Simple as dirt. It'll become sort of relevant to us in a little bit that this pattern repeats itself every 2 beats. So the next thing that I added was the hi-hat, and this kind of starts to hint at where things get a little interesting. So here's the kick and snare with the hi-hat added on. Here's the hi-hat on its own. What you may notice is that it's playing 16th notes, but every 5th one is accented. And so what that means is where the kick and snare basically had a period or a meter of 2 beats, the hi-hat, the actual line itself that's looping, occupies a space of 5/16 notes, which means when you translate it into whole beats, it lines up with the kick and snare again every 10 beats. You can work that out based on the least common multiple between the length of the kick and snare line and the length of the hi-hat line translated into beats. So if a hi-hat line takes up 1.25 beats and the kick snare line take up 2, the least common multiple of those two numbers is 10. It takes 10 beats for the hi-hats to line up with the kick and snare again. So that kind of laid the foundation for the next big thing I did that I think really actually gives this beat its sense of movement and its intrigue, which is the toms. So I'm going to play a little bit of the full line again, and then I'll show you the toms isolated. And here's the toms on their own. So they sound kind of weird on their own, obviously, but basically the way that I actually put that part together is the hi-hat was basically the product of me messing around, and then I basically filled the toms in the length of time that the hi-hat takes to meet up with the rest of the beat. So basically the toms and the hi-hat plus kick and snare share a common meter, which is 2.5 measures, or if you want to put it in whole measures, which I guess you should, 5 measures. The thing that really makes this technique compelling, to me at least, is what happens when the rest of the instruments come in. So I'm going to play a little bit from that part. I'll just start from a bar beforehand.
The drugs I've got will make you fall asleep while you're awake. If I come up for air, then push my head down from above. We're drowning deep inside ourselves and calling it self-love.
Yeah, so basically what's happening here is the chord progression and the riff that accompanies are occupying a space of 8 bars in the song. And that's like a very typical length of time in pop music, kind of not unlike the kick and snare thing. Having an 8-bar progression or a progression based off of a multiple of 4 bars is kind of like a really canonical, recognizable, normal thing in a song, right? This kind of creates an interesting situation, though, where the drums are looping every 2.5 measures, but the rest of everything else that's going on is looping every 8 measures. So now we actually have a third meter mixed in, and that third meter is the 8 bars that it takes for the progression to complete. 8 bars, compared to anything we messed around with before, is a pretty big number. What's the least common multiple of 8 and 2.5? And the answer, it turns out, is 40. It takes 40 bars for the chord progression / the riff and the drum beat to realign in the same place. So basically what we've created here is a situation where even though this drum loop is just a single thing a couple seconds long that keeps on repeating for ages, it takes a really long time. I think it's a minute and 20 seconds for it to loop back around. That's actually compounded extra when you consider that I'm actually only giving you a half truth here. My song actually has it's a half progression in the intro, and the full progression is actually 16 bars, so that doubles it again to 80 bars. So basically we have 80 bars before the drum loop realigns in the way it originally did with the rest of the song. Out of these much smaller constituent parts, you've basically created this huge amount of variety that's constantly evolving. And it's easy to imagine how you could extend this a little bit and make it so that you never even hear the same combination of accents and stuff in your beat. And I think that's really cool. It's like kind of an easy way to squeeze out infinite variety, and just, it's a little bit stochastic. You don't really know what's going to happen, which is kind of exciting in its own right too. Now, it's easy to see how this kind of technique could on paper, it could be pretty chaotic. Like, having that much variety is kind of counter to the idea that repetition is a really important thing in music. And if you never hear the same thing twice, then it's not really going to sound like music, or at least it's not going to sound like very coherent music. Maybe that's an overgeneralization, but I think there's some truth to it, at least in pop music. I think that's where it becomes important that we started with a really basic element of a kick and a snare on 1, 2, 3, and 4. That basic dance pulse. One thing that I find is true in music in general is that you can get away with an awful lot of really weird out there stuff if you kind of fix it around a scaffolding of very basic, canonical, recognizable stuff. It's like the simple and almost boring, in a sense, gives the listener's brain something to latch onto, while the rest of it gives the listener's brain reason to keep on latching on. So that philosophy kind of goes well beyond this technique, but certainly applies here, because at the end of the day, the core of what's going on is in the kick and snare. But when you factor in all the rest of it, it just adds a lot of subtle motion under the surface and interesting variations on the same theme. The reason why I find this especially fascinating in a digital landscape is because when you have actual human musicians playing parts that loop, it takes a great amount of skill and a great amount of practice, and they actually have to sit there and do it for a long time on end to create polymetric parts. But a computer can do that no problem, and it's actually very easy. It took me probably maybe a half hour to make this drum loop, and that's mostly because I was screwing around with a lot of different things that I didn't end up using. You could do this in 5 minutes and access just this whole realm of variety that you wouldn't be able to otherwise. So I think it's a really interesting thing to come out of using digital technology with old techniques. Kind of opens up new ways to use them and maybe make certain things that weren't so streamlined extremely intuitive and natural. So yeah, that's that's it. That's my spiel. Check out the song if you haven't already, and subscribe. I am mostly just posting music, but every now and then I do something like this, and it's a good time. So yeah, see ya.